leave King George's control. These are men in the green uniforms of the Queen's Rangers, men trained in forest and frontier warfare, skilled in adopting the tactics of their Native American allies, who we see here represented by warriors from the Delaware and Mohawk nations, backed up by the Redcoat forces, consisting of detachments from two of His Majesty's regiments, the 22nd Regiment of Foot, the famous 2-2, Regiment of Foot, Wolf's Home. The 2-2s are 22nd, wear buff-coloured breeches and faces with the yellowish tinge you can see there in their uniforms. The 47th wear the more regular white breeches and white waistcoats and white facings of that particular regiment. The sentries now, oblivious, discussing politics, telling jokes, cracking banter, oblivious now to the advance not only of the Queen's Rangers, the Native Americans, and a section of His Majesty's Coldstream Guards. And we see now, fire open, the sentries running for cover, breaking for cover, to give advance warning, much needed warning, of the advance of the Redcoats and their militia and their volunteer allies. The men nearest the barrier, as I mentioned, men from the Coldstream Guards, one of the King's Guards regiments, acting here as light infantry, operating in open order, with adapted weapons and headgear to make them more suitable in the field. We see now the colonial militia rallying onto the field. One might look at them as a ragtag rabble, which indeed in many ways they are. As I mentioned, very few of them with military service. You'll see some elements of uniform amongst these men who will have fought alongside the Redcoats in the battles of the 7 Years' War against the French and the Native Americans. These men, and indeed the odd woman, form part of the New Hampshire Minutemen Company. That is, civilians, settlers, traders, merchants, farmers, who have volunteered to drop everything they are doing, arm themselves and turn out at literally a minute's notice to defend what they see as their rights. We see them flying the flag there, the Don't Tread on Me banner, designed by Paul Revere, threatening the King's men not to interfere with the rights and positions of their own individual states, which, as we know, will soon come together to form the United States of America. So this open field warfare, the sort of fighting that these men are used to. And even as we see the Redcoats, King George's heavy infantry, have also adopted a light infantry tactic. Those who were here yesterday will have seen the Redcoats fighting in their more traditional close order two-rank deep formation. A combination of casualties and indeed of contempt for the fighting ability of their colonial adversaries led the Redcoats to themselves begin to operate in an open order formation. Not quite as open as their irregular allies, but nevertheless a real change from the rigours and linear tactics of European warfare. But the Redcoats still maintaining their disciplined volley and section fire. All the combatants here, as you'll notice, are using muzzle-loading, black powder, flintlock weapons. The military weapons are generally the famous brown vest smoothbore, firing a 3/4 of an inch ball, accurately to 30 or 40 paces, and with a killing range of some 200. Some of the colonials will be armed with the rifle, a weapon with grooves in the barrel, giving the weapon a much greater range and accuracy. But this makes them slower to load, and perhaps even more importantly, means few of the colonial militia can carry or fix a bayonet. In 1770s warfare, bayonet assaults and the threat of the bayonet is still a very important feature of warfare, both in Europe and in the Americas. The Redcoats now closing into their more solid formation, the militia maintaining their open order, maintaining an irregular, harassing fire. The native allies, as was so often the case, operating on the flank of the army, on the flank of the regulars, awaiting for the opportunity to move in and swoop in their own particular, inimitable native way. You will see one woman fighting in the ranks of the colonial militia. This was not unusual. Women on the frontier were trained. It was felt necessary to train them in the use of weapons. There were still threats from Native Americans and other ruffians, and so many women were equally capable of handling a weapon as their husbands and children. And these women acquired the generic name of Molly Pitcher. They were named after one woman who, at the Battle of Monmouth, an early battle of the war, took over her husband's role. Her husband was a gunner on an artillery piece, and he was killed in action. Molly Pitcher took over the job, carried water to swab out the cannon, and so the name of Molly Pitcher was then applied to all the women combatants. See, now the regulars, having tried open order and close order, falling back. The irregular harassing tactics actually having an effect on the solid body. Of course, the problem with close order is that you make an excellent target. The militia, the light infantry and the natives are spread out. The redcoats now making themselves a very inviting target. Punched together shoulder to shoulder and elbow to elbow, forearms reach behind each other. An excellent target for the rebel marksman. Queen's Rangers now effectively out of the action. The Native Americans falling back. Native Americans had a very cautious way of warfare. They did not believe in throwing their lives away unnecessarily. The natives now falling back, resting on the main body of the redcoats. Most Native American nations did indeed fight King George. They recognised the danger that the colonial settlers posed to them. Under British administration, native lands were held separate and kept free of white invasion. One of the colony settlers argued that they wished to advance into Native American lands against the wishes of both King George and the native tribes. So the Native Americans now, the Delaware, the Mohawk falling back. These are woodland Indians, not the plains Indians we see so often in Hollywood films, riding on horseback. These men's natural domain was the woods and hills of the eastern territories of the United States. The redcoats now giving ground, taking casualties, giving ground, still firing as they fall back, but seeing now that yesterday King George has made triumphs, destroyed the powder store, chased off the militia. Today, a different story. The colonial militia steal King George's finest. 47, the 22nd falling to the field in some disorder. The colonials clubbing their muskets. No better than this. The muskets can deal a deadly blow, as we can see. So the surviving redcoats, the last stand falling to the musket butts of the colonials. The Rangers dead, the natives back to their forest wilderness, and the redcoats, those who survive, fleeing to face another day. And so, in this early stage of the war, April 1775, we see an early victory for the colonial militia. Perhaps a lucky one, because George Washington, the main commander of the American forces, recognised himself that a colonial militia alone was no match for the disciplined forces of the Crown. And whilst the colonial militia and these irregular fighters had an important role to play, indeed continued to do so throughout the war, Washington recognised that he needed to raise, train and equip a regular army. He called it the Continental Army. Washington had served with the British Army in the French and Indian Wars. He knew just how good the British Army was. He uniformed, trained and equipped his American Army in pretty much exactly the same way. They wore a blue uniform rather than a red, but they fought in close order with the American version of the brown vest, in close order with the bayonet, and only by fielding such men were Washington and the Americans able, after 8 years of bitter fighting, to force a surrender. We see now the harsh way that civil wars developed, because this was of course a civil war. These people were not Americans as we know them today at this time. These were Englishmen, Irishmen, Scotsmen, both the settlers and the forces themselves, a few Germans and other European nationalities, but primarily the War of Independence was a bitter and brutal civil war. For example, the Queen's Rangers, who we see here having fallen, were forced, when the war was concluded in 1783, to take themselves and their families over the border into Canada, which remained in British control, to avoid the retribution of those who had fought against the King. A very, very tragic time indeed for many, many families. It's probably the case that a third of the American population actively favoured rebellion and freeing themselves from King George. A third were loyalists, like the Queen Rangers, and as in all civil wars, the remaining third waited on the sidelines, desperately hoping the war would not affect them, and then, when it did, only then choosing the side they were effectively forced to serve. So we see now the various forces reforming, the victorious colonial militia now forming in two ranks, the Queen's Rangers with their green coats now moving forward to take their place alongside the barrier, accompanied by the section of the Coldstream Guards, and the 2-2s and Woolstone form now into heavy infantry formation, moving forward to take the flank. Queen's Rangers, ladies and gentlemen. The Coldstream Guards, light infantry. The 22nd Regiment and the 47th Regiment of Foot.